Prime Minister Mark Carney is in Washington today to meet with President Donald Trump about trade and tariffs. Since Trump's inauguration on January 20th, he has imposed a number of tariffs on Canada, targeting steel and aluminum production, as well as the Canadian auto industry, which is tightly integrated with the American industry, with parts and vehicles crossing the US Canada border as many as 8 times during manufacturing. The question on everyone's mind today is whether Trump intends to be heavy handed with its closest neighbor, or is he open to negotiating a new trade deal with Carney? I interviewed trade expert Joseph Steinberg about today's meeting. He's an associate professor of economics with the University of Toronto. On February 4th, economist Joseph Steinberg wrote a piece called Canada Gets a Break from American Tariffs for Now. Here's how our economy would fare if Trump changes his mind. In it, he argued that Canada's most effective defense is trade de-escalation. So, Professor Steinberg, can you explain what you meant by that?
Well, the thrust of my piece was that Canada and the US, as many people know, have a very asymmetric trade relationship in the following sense. Well, it's true that we trade very similar amounts in raw dollars with each other. Those raw dollars mean very different things for our respective economies. The US economy is about 10 times as large as the Canadian economy. If imports and exports are roughly balanced, that means that those trade flows are, very roughly about 10 times more important for Canada than they are for the United States. And so tariffs, trade wars coming from both sides of the border going to have disproportionately large effect on Canada relative to the United States. And so the best course of action trade issues with the United States is pretty much always going to be doing whatever it can do to foster free trade in either direction. Getting Trump to remove his tariffs, removing our own trade barriers, both of those things are the best courses of action to helping our economy kind of thrive in the face of this challenge.
Now, you set out three priorities. One of them is the first one, the biggest one, is getting Trump to end the fentanyl emergency, the immigrant emergency. And I guess those were just pretexts for invoking American emergency powers. Why is that important?
Well, so that I see that as being Carney's main priority here, because that's where the vast majority of the current tariffs that the U.S. has levied on Canada are coming from. As you said, Trump used his authority under the power to levy tariffs. And that statute requires that he declare a national emergency about something. And so he declared an emergency related to fentanyl. That is what allowed him to levy initially 25% tariffs on everything. He has, as we know at this point, backed off on that, quite a bit. All trade that is compliant with the rules of the pre-existing USMCA is exempt. There are other things, steel and aluminum; those get tariffed under a different executive order. Auto parts get tariffed under a different executive order. But again, for autos and auto parts, there have been lots of exemptions and clawbacks. So right now the biggest priority is to try to get those 25% tariffs off of everything that is, not USMCA compliant. By the way, that includes energy, although energy eventually got lowered down to 10%. Energy is the single biggest thing that we export to the United States. So if we can get President Trump to go, to revoke this emergency declaration and say, look, Canada's done enough, or they've made commitments to do enough, I'm going to get rid of that emergency and revoke these 25% tariffs, 10% tariffs on energy. That would be a big win for Carney and make a major impact on our economy.
Right. So initial reports out of the meeting between Trump and Carney are that Trump says he won't move on the tariffs in the short term. And it kind of looks like he is trying to set up a renegotiation of the USMCA. But we'll get to that because that's your third priority. The second priority you set out was getting bigger tariff exemption for Canadian-made vehicles. Maybe you could explain that.
Yeah, so the President Trump put a little while ago 25% tariffs on vehicles coming into the United States. That is from all around the world, not just Canada. And then he went back on that a little bit for Canada and Mexico and exempted the American content of vehicles coming into the United States through the auspices of the USMCA program. So vehicles that are assembled in Canada and Mexico that contain parts that were built in the United States, the kind of share of the value of those vehicles that can be attributed to those American-made parts is not tariffed. And now, more recently, President Trump has put in place 25% tariffs on car parts as well. But again, he has exempted entirely USMCA compliant car parts. But again, those finished vehicles that are, don't consist entirely of American car parts, they are getting tariffed to some degree. Auto sector, pretty important for Canada. For a variety of reasons, that trade is kind of really important to how integrated the supply chains are, how difficult it is for firms in that sector to kind of reorient their supply chains, given how kind of far in advance they have to make big investment decisions. And so getting President Trump to agree to kind of go for an even deeper exemption, perhaps just exempt USMCA compliant finished vehicles altogether, just like USMCA compliant car parts, that would again be another big win for Canada, I would say.
Your third priority was establishing a timeline for complete renegotiation of the USMCA. And on this point, Carney seems to have scored a major victory because Trump acknowledged that they're going to be renegotiating the trade agreement with Canada. This is in the meeting in the Oval Office today. And he said it's good for all countries. He said that we're going to work on some subtle changes, maybe. I mean, it was typical Trump, right? He doesn't just talk out of both sides of his mouth. He's got all kinds of. But it does seem that we're now going to renegotiate the agreement that he renegotiated during Trump 1.0, which is pretty much what you thought should be the third priority here.
Yeah, so it is important to mention that the USMCA was scheduled to be up for renegotiation in 2026 anyway. So it had a 5-year sunset clause and it had to be renegotiated. But President Trump has repeatedly stated his intention to try to accelerate that renegotiation timeline and try to start working on that, I think, imminently, or perhaps if not imminently, starting over the summer or in the fall. And so I think, again, my third priority was to try to establish some kind of, clear timeline to kind of manage expectations around what that renegotiation process would look like in terms of when it would happen, at which different stages. But in addition to that, to try to get some clarity about what are the specific things that the Trump administration is looking for in the renegotiation, right? President Trump wants to just renegotiate it, but what does that mean? Why does he want to renegotiate? What is he looking for in those renegotiations? What aspects of it does he not view as being fair anymore, even though he was the one who negotiated the first one? And so I think there are going to be things like, broadly speaking, increased market access for certain sectors, as well as the kind of perennial complaints about non-tariff barriers in the services sector that have been issues not only during this Trump administration, but during the first Trump administration, as well as the Biden administration. So the digital services tax under Bill C-11, for example, this is something that has been raised time and time again. I'm really looking for Carney to try to perhaps say that this is on the table, getting rid of this, getting rid of that. I don't see that was at all a very good idea to begin with. And if we can get rid of that, that I see that as kind of a win-win in some sense. It benefits Canadians as well as helps us get a better trade deal as well.
Okay, so apparently, according to CBC reporting, the talks are actually going to start today. Apparently,
oh wow, okay, we just found that out. Great.
There's a working lunch going on between Trump and Carney and senior officials from both sides, and they're going to be they've launched the talks already. But my take in this as a non-trade economist or non-economist, but it seems like Trump has gone through. He's made us jump through hoops. He's overturned the apple cart, and here we are back again at the table, and probably only tweaking the agreement that he tweaked last time. And this is a very bizarre way to conduct trade negotiations. Would you agree?
It is a bizarre way to conduct trade negotiations. it does bear all the hallmarks of how he did it during his first administration, if perhaps in a more aggressive way. I mean, during the first administration, he, tweeted out famously, that he would have to think about terminating NAFTA. He put tariffs on steel and aluminum, softwood lumber, and used those tariffs as kind of a way to kickstart negotiations of a new NAFTA. And again, the USMCA that replaced NAFTA, as you mentioned, it's not very different. In many respects, it's pretty darn similar. There's somewhat more onerous domestic content requirements in the vehicle sector. That's about it. And so you're absolutely right. If the end result of all of this is going to be, USMCA 2.0 with, 27% domestic content requirement in cars instead of 25%. I mean, it's a whole lot of pain for not a whole lot on either end. But this does seem to be Trump's MO. So it's what we got to work with.
Now, because we're energy journalists, we do a lot of work on the Alberta oil and gas industry, exports down to the U.S. It kind of looks like, that maybe Alberta is going to get out of this more or less scot-free, and after the agreement is renegotiated, whenever that takes place, presumably maybe this fall, the 10% tariff will be removed, and essentially they go back to the status quo where Alberta, or the Canadian industry has got, extensive infrastructure for north-south flow of mostly north flow exports of oil and gas. And all of this discussion we've been having in Canada about what to do about that just kind of goes away. And we go back to the way we were doing things for decades.
Yeah, I think that's the likely outcome, at least in terms of the tariff situation. I mean, you have to recognize that energy is not something that President Trump has really spoken much about. He has raised issues around the automotive sector. Yesterday, he raised issues about the movie industry. This is a new one for me. I've not heard him talk about that yet before. But really, he doesn't seem to be particularly perturbed by U.S. imports of oil, although ironically, that is where the entirety of the trade deficit that the United States has with Canada is coming from. When you get rid of oil, the United States runs a big trade surplus with Canada. But be that as it may, he doesn't really seem to find those oil imports particularly offensive. Why that is, I don't know. But
would you like me to answer that? Would you like me to answer that for you?
Well, you can answer it. I mean, I have ideas, but feel free.
Well, what happened is after the 70s and 80s, when it looked like we were going to have an oil shortage, the decision was made to develop the Alberta oil sands, which produces bitumen, which turns into an ultra heavy sour crude. And then there are 5.5 million barrels of ultra heavy sour crude refining capacity in the US now. We supply probably about 3.5 million barrels a day of that. We're the big player in that. And
Yeah.
those refineries spent, I've seen estimates ranging up as high as $100 billion to re-kit their refineries. So the cost to the American refining industry to then convert back to light sweet crude, it would be just horrendous, like tens of billions of dollars. And then you'd have to reorient your pipelines to get the crude. It's just a horrendous job to do what he kind of implied he would like to do. So I would imagine that the American Petroleum Institute has been in his ear a lot about those problems, and which is why he's kind of backed off. I mean, the economics of it are just too brutal for even Donald Trump to impose that on, a constituency of his. So I think that's why.
Yeah, I know. I think you're absolutely right. I guess I will push back on that in a little bit and just say that I see very similar costs for the auto industry in terms of trying to reorient towards the modus operandi that he has envisioned. Now, the constituencies are somewhat different. There's a lot more blue states involved, especially in terms of the actual U.S. automakers. There's a whole lot of foreign automakers that operate in the south of the United States. But leaving that aside, it's going to cost the auto industry hundreds of billions of dollars as well to completely reshape their supply chains. Nevertheless, he still wants them to do it. And so I entirely take your point that I totally agree that the current supply chain in the energy sector is going to take decades and many hundreds of billions of dollars to undo. But I don't necessarily ascribe quite that much rationality to President Trump's tariff motivations. But in any event, regardless of what it is, he isn't perturbed by those oil imports much, rationally or irrationally. And so I see that 10% tariff on energy as being kind of the first to go in all likelihood.
Fair enough. Well, thank you very much for this. It's been very insightful and
Yeah.
really appreciate it. And I have absolutely no doubt that we'll be coming back to you in the coming months to try to explain what in the heck is going on with negotiations.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great meeting you and great having me.
Right. Thank you.